Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's great to see all of you. So thank you for joining me. My name is Brenda Bailey Hughes. This is Learn Plus, a live LinkedIn learning event that I host each month where I share a tip or two that I hope is useful to you, normally in the leadership and communication space. And then I also provide one tip in case you're a learning and development professional or a coach or a training consultant and you want to share this information with others. What's one great way to do that? As we get started, it would be great if you notice the comments in probably the right-hand section of your screen. If you would let us know, where are you coming in from today? And since we are focused today on communicating data, I would love to know what types of industry you're from, or if you could be even more specific, what kind of data you typically work in. So for example, I might type Bloomington, Indiana, which is where I am today. It's in the Midwestern part of the US, about 4 hours south of Chicago. And the type of data I work with is frequently statistics around learners and what they're learning, what they're not learning, how they're using various platforms. So a lot of educational research and stats would be the type of data that I typically work with. But how about you? Where are you from? And what kind of data are you working with? I will let you start typing while I give you an overview of where we're headed this morning. So a quick show, no guest today. You're just stuck with me. And we will be looking at two different ways to organize data heavy conversations or data heavy presentations. One, if you are ultimately making a recommendation, and one, if it's not really your job to make a recommendation, but you do have an analysis, you do have maybe even a conclusion to the data that you are sharing, or an update type of presentation perhaps, that's very data heavy. With both of those, I have an example. The first one is totally hypothetical. The second one that I will share is an organizational pattern that I used for a presentation of a research study that I did. The research study doesn't matter, and we won't get into the weeds on that, but I want you to hear how I shaped the story. Good, I see some folks coming in from Singapore and Algeria, and okay, and we work in oil and gas industry. Great, good to know. So the stats that you work with are going to be around natural resources maybe, or about usage. I'm curious what kind, if you want to pinpoint a little bit more of the data that you work in. After we talk about those, or actually integrated into the conversation about the two types of organizing patterns to make sure that people can follow your train of thought when you're working with data, I'm also going to share 3 tips for visually communicating the data. So if you're creating slides, or you're working with slides that someone else made for you, but you can tweak them a little bit or make suggestions, I hope you leave with 3 really clear, crisp ways to sharpen up your visuals or your deck. So that is where we're headed. Okay, Ronald, thank you, is using data stacks and Snowflake. Okay, good. Thank you so much. And so glad that you're here. API connectors. Okay, good. This is great. This is helpful. You are all working in such interesting fields. As other people log in and share where they're from and what kind of data they work with, you might sort of take note. Is there somebody that is in a similar field that could brainstorm with you sometimes when you're working with a data-heavy presentation? Or sometimes it's even better to pull someone who's not in the same field as you are, because if a novice can look at your deck and listen to you present and understand what you're talking about, then someone in the industry is certainly going to be able to work with the data that you are talking about or sharing with others. So a great networking opportunity today, because we are typically on these monthly calls a really global group of folks that have lots and lots of experience in various areas. So I encourage you to note names and connect with each other through LinkedIn if you think that could be helpful to you. All right, so I promised you 2 organizational frameworks. So the first one assumes that all of this data that you're working with and the analysis that you've done has led you to a particular recommendation. Great, glad you're here. From India, mechanical engineering and test data. Okay, great, thank you, very helpful. There might be some good collaborations between our attendees today. So typically when we are in that research phase or when we're gathering data, we use a systematic, a lot of you use the scientific methodology of we collect data, we analyze the data using whatever types of analysis we plan to use, whatever models, whatever frameworks, whatever statistical analyses are appropriate. We use that analyses, and then based on that, we reach a conclusion. Hi, Eunice. Welcome from Texas and works in omics data. Thank you. Glad you're here. So we gather the data, we analyze the data, we reach a conclusion. Now, many people then present in that same order. That's so intuitive to us. So we start with, here's what all the data was and how we gathered it, and here's how we analyzed it. And based on that, here's the conclusion that we've drawn. What I'm going to recommend today is that we, for conversations where we're making recommendations to decision makers particularly, we just flip that script completely. Instead, we start with the conclusion or the recommendation, and then we talk about what data we collected and how we analyzed it. And the reason I want you to start with the conclusion first is that decision makers are busy people. They are running from meeting to meeting to meeting. Sometimes they can't even remember when they walk into the meeting with you exactly what it is you're talking about or why they're there. And so we need to start with some really quick context and then setting that stage of here is the recommendation, so that as they're listening to your data and your analysis of the data, they can be thinking about that in terms of the recommendation that you made. So it makes more sense to them why you're sharing the data that you're sharing. Otherwise, people start to sort of zone out, tune out, think about their next meeting because they're unclear why you're even sharing the data that you're sharing. If you've already made your recommendation obvious, then they know how to listen to this data and they know the good questions to ask. They know where they have doubts about does the data support the recommendation. So you'll have a much more interesting, robust Q&A. And hopefully you'll have decision makers that are making decisions based on solid data. Brian, glad you joined us from San Diego using syndicated primary data, business data, mainly to support consumer insights, category management, business analytics, use cases. Great. And you've got Brian's LinkedIn connection there. So absolutely do some networking with each other. One of my recommendations today is to always have a second set of eyes on a deck, a data heavy deck or a data heavy presentation. And you can be that second set of eyes for each other because you all work in data heavy fields. All right, so let me give you a completely hypothetical example. This is about the Acme super speed running shoes. So we're going to pretend that you all work for Acme Corporation. All the data in here is completely fictional and just made up. So Natasha, if you want to bring our slide deck up. So you've been asked by Acme, maybe you were asked to analyze 4 different product categories and determine where the most likely next product would be for them, something along those lines. Now, so you did so, and you're going to start with the recommendation first, which you, after all of your analysis, you've decided that it's that their next product development should be these super speed running shoes. And then you're going to tell them the 3 reasons why that's a great recommendation. So what is your conclusion or recommendation, followed by the 3 strongest reasons why they should do that? What? Why? If you leave with nothing else today, that's one tip I want you to remember. What is your conclusion or recommendation? What are the why, the 3 reasons why that conclusion is valid or that recommendation is smart? Now, I used to say there's nothing magic about 3 reasons why, but I've actually changed my tune on that. It does seem like as I've tracked, and this is some of the data that I work with, I've tracked recommendation presentations that are adopted or acted on and those that are not. And it does seem that if there's only 2 reasons why, people are a little skeptical, like, well, that doesn't quite seem like enough reasons that we should take your action. But if there's 4 or 5 or 6 reasons why they should take the action, there's a good shot that you haven't really tailored well to the audience. You haven't picked the 3 reasons that are most compelling, most persuasive to that particular audience, that important to them. Or you've got some overlap. There hasn't been real clarity in thinking. So we're looking for that what, why pattern of organization as you're trying to structure the framework for your deck and your presentation. So here you see I made up 3 reasons that Acme Company should engage in developing super speed shoes. There's a market demand. They can outmaneuver their competitors, and they've got an innovative product design strength within the Acme Company. All right. So then each one of those reasons is supported by evidence. Now, I just love symmetry. So for the pretty picture here in front of you, I gave 2 pieces of evidence for each one of those reasons. That I don't think you can dictate, because in reality, there's sometimes we only have one really good, strong study or piece of evidence to support one of our reasons that the conclusion is valid or the recommendation is a strong recommendation. Sometimes maybe you have 4 or 5 or 6 pieces of evidence to support a particular reason, and they're all strong and they're all necessary, in which case you might have more. But for the sake of today's slide, I just gave 2 pieces of evidence to support each one of those reasons. Now, where your slides come from, if you're presenting visual data to an audience, are from these chunks called evidence. So frequently what I see are people have the reasons why, and maybe you list those reasons in sort of your introductory material, but those aren't the data. That's not where the evidence-based information is. That's not where your numerical data is. And so that's not confusing to your audience. If I tell an audience, hey, there are 3 great reasons we should go into super speed shoes. There's a great market demand. We can outmaneuver our competitors. We've got the product design innovation capacity. They can grasp that. Where they're going to bog down is when I get into the data. So that's where you need the visuals. So think of your slides lining up to that bottom line of data. Does that make sense? And Brian commented that the power of 3 is easier to remember, and it looks like you did your homework. Exactly, Brian. So what, why? Those magic of 3, the power of 3, use your 3 reasons. So let's just play around with this chunk called evidence 6. So in my totally hypothetical scenario here, we've got an R&D product development time was down 40%, which makes it feasible for us to develop super speed shoes. One part of your rationale always has to be, is it feasible? How do we do this? Can we do this? Has to be a part of the logical build for a recommendation. So in this one, we're gonna focus in then on maybe what a slide would look like related to evidence 6, the fact that our R&D has the bandwidth to do this, to take on super speed shoes. And so we might just say, hey, look, product development time has come down from our previous development time. Maybe that was last year, maybe that was 2 years ago, to our current development time. So super simplified data here, just for the sake of showing you how I pulled from the evidence chunk of that outline to create a slide. This is also a good time to introduce some of our the 3 tips that I wanted to share about visual delivery. One of them, so right now, maybe you can give a little critique to this slide. You can critique it mentally. You could put some comments in the chat. If you have some ideas of how to improve this slide, I'll give you some suggestions that I thought would be important. One is which, and this is my first tip, and that is to write informative titles to all of your slides. So if we go back and we look at this, product development time, I call that a placeholder type of title. It doesn't really tell your reader or your viewer, if your audience, if you're doing this live, it doesn't tell them anything. I know that this slide is about product development time, but I don't know what your conclusion is. I don't know what your research is about product development time. So if we just change that and say our R&D department has reduced development time by 40%, already this is a stronger visual because we are crafting the narrative. We are telling the story the way we want people to hear the story. So tip number one, write informative titles. In fact, I always tell people that I should be able to flip through your PowerPoint deck or whatever software you're using. I should be able to flip through your visual deck and just read your titles and understand your what, why, and the data that supports it with just reading your titles. So that means your titles are going to be longer than you're probably accustomed to seeing because they're actually telling the story with you. So that's one suggestion I would make on this slide is write a better title, write a title that actually informs your audience of something. For those of you that read newspapers or online newspapers, think headlines here, where even if you don't read the rest of the article, you kind of know the who, what, where, when, why, and how of the story just from a good headline. Now, I'm not talking about the kinds of headlines that are teasers, that are just trying to entice people to read more. I'm talking about sort of maybe the old-fashioned headlines where the headline of an article itself tells the story, at least in some degree of completeness. Here's a second tip that I want you to remember for today in terms of visuals, and another example of that is decluttering the slide. So what are some of the things you noticed that I did to declutter the slide from here to here? Did you catch some of the changes that declutter this? Probably the most obvious is what? The color changes. Instead of these bright reds and greens, the distinction between current and previous development time is still obvious to the learner and to your reader without so much cacophony of visual cues as red and green. Red and green are also really hard for people who experience some degree of color blindness. And so they weren't great color choices to begin with. And then we simply don't need that distraction. There were some other things that I did to clean up this slide. Did anyone catch other things that I did to clean up this slide? We had this, and we moved to this. What else is different? Did you catch? This one's pretty subtle. I made the font smaller so that the title is all one line, which gives us a little more white space, which is always a decluttering strategy. And I aligned this title to the y-axis of my graph, which is always a helpful alignment. Yes, Eunice caught it. I got rid of the trend lines or the grid lines. They served no particularly, if you see the grid lines here, the trend lines, they're not useful. Sometimes they are, sometimes you need them, but in this case, they weren't really serving us. So I de-emphasized those trend lines. Great catch, Eunice. So those are a few things that we can do to declutter. I'll show you some more examples of decluttering, give you another shot at trying to guess them here in a little bit with some more audience participation. But that's pro tip number 2, declutter. So number 1 is write informative headlines. Number 2 is declutter. And number 3 is try to focus your audience's attention on what you want them to notice. So simply by adding this downward bar, I've tried to focus the audience on exactly what I want them to see, that 40% reduction in development time. There are other ways that we can focus audiences. We can use color, we can use intensity, we can use proximity, we can use these call outs like this one that is a literal sort of, hey, notice this, notice this. All of those are ways to focus your audience. So those are your 3 visual tips. And again, I'll show you some more examples so that they really start to click. And I want you to be thinking about decks that you're designing right now. Do they have informative titles? Could I read just the titles and understand your story? Have you decluttered as best you can? And have you focused the reader on exactly what you want them to see? So all of that is in a recommendation speech. Now, many of you are working in areas where ultimately you're doing updates on analyses, you're providing some conclusions to data that we might be able to draw, but you're not necessarily making a specific recommendation. In that case, I'm going to recommend using the 4 C's of storytelling for your organizational pattern. So the 4 C's of storytelling are that there's always a character or characters involved. So these are the people that are affected by the oil and gas industry statistics that you're dealing with, or by the business use case that you're developing. They are the real people involved. The context is the setting, the situation that led us up to where we are in this data analysis. Conflict is sort of the rising tension in the story. If you think about any good story, from a fairy tale that you heard as a child to a good movie, there's always this sort of inflection point where everything comes to a head a little bit. It doesn't have to be conflict in the traditional sense. In fact, often with data, the conflict that I'm pointing out is maybe a surprise to the audience. Like, we have been working on the assumption that this is true, but now that we have this data, we know, oops, our assumption was wrong. That's a clash. That's a conflict. We expected to find this, but oh my gosh, we found this instead. That's the conflict that exists. So think of conflict in a more global way than in a fight between characters or something. And then, of course, we want to bring a conclusion to our story. We want to wrap up with either next steps or the meaning. What does this all mean to us? Or what should we consider the important aspects of this? So we've got to draw it to an end. Character and context can come in any order. Conflict needs to be sort of the center point of your presentation. And then, of course, the conclusion is the end of your presentation. So let me give you another example, more real than the Acme super speed shoes. This was some data that I collected when I was running a pilot study for 2 different classroom platforms, course management systems. So if you've been in an academic class in the last 20 years, you were probably using some sort of online platform in your interactions in that class. It's where your grades were. It's where maybe your professor posted lectures or articles that you went in to read. So I was testing the idea of a gamified version of a course management system. All right. I had thousands and thousands and thousands of points of data. I had access to, I was testing with 100 students, and I could see every interaction the students had with every piece of content in the course management system. So thousands of pieces of data from that alone. Plus, I had surveyed the students twice on satisfaction levels and easeability of use with the systems. And so I had all of this user-gathered survey data too. So I knew then, when I needed to present this out at a teaching conference, that thousands and thousands and thousands and tens and hundreds of thousands of pieces of data would overwhelm the audience. I needed to shape it into something of a story. I wasn't making a specific recommendation either. At the end of the day, I wasn't there to tell them, you should all use the gamified system, or you should all use the traditional classroom system that we've been using. More what I wanted, and so what I started with, was my conclusion, which was simply, we need to have a conversation about the best use cases for the traditional platform or the gamified platform. And so that's how I started the presentation. I said, I'm going to explain a study to you. And my call to action is that I had maybe 20 minutes also, by the way, to do all of this presentation, which I know is probably an experience a lot of you have. Tons and tons and tons of rich, robust, interesting data. And you get 10 minutes on the agenda to explain it, right? So how do we make the most out of that time? Well, I found it was helpful to introduce this large group of faculty to my particular students. So I said, I teach a first year class. So I have young 18 to 19 traditional age students. They are business school students. They are highly competitive, and they love to play video games. They could spend hours and hours and hours a day playing video games. So now I've introduced the character. And then I needed to set up the context. And I said, I was curious if a gamified learning platform would be more engaging with these students or affect their final performance. So these were my hypotheses in the study. So I had two different sections. I had a section of 50 students who were in the traditional classroom course platform, and I had 50 students from other sections that were in a gamified version of the platform. Besides those different platforms, they had access to exactly the same assignments, curriculum, product development, access to all the same information, and experienced the same lectures with me in class. So then I provided a little more. I'm going to call the system Gamify It. That wasn't the name of the system that I was testing, but I just want to keep that confidential. I said, okay, so Gamify It, the gaming platform, adds some gaming features like avatars and leaderboards. This is all still context. That's the reason I have the little context icon down there in the bottom, just showing you how I set up what the context was for my audience. They got 0 up scoring. Now we hit the conflict, right? I've set up that we expected students to like it because they love video games and they love gaming. And here they had all of these gaming features, but students didn't love it. So now we're to the clash part of the story. How do I know that students didn't love it? So now I'm in that evidence. So they didn't love it. And you might have noticed I said they didn't love it, but there is a plot twist. And I'll come back to that. Now, why I did that was to sort of keep interest of my audience by telling them there is a plot twist coming up. So students didn't love it. How do I know it? Because I asked them to report how motivating each of these different features were in the system. And on a 1 to 5 scale, 1 not at all motivated, with 5 they're very motivated, we would expect hopefully to see at least a 3. So remember, focus your audience. That red bar at the 3 is how I'm trying to focus them on 3. I want 3 and above on all of these to show that they were motivated or very motivated. But what we actually found was that all of the features in the system on motivating students, as self-reported, fell below that 3 that we would have hoped for. So we're still in that conflict piece. And then I also shared with them to further the evidence. I had some qualitative data to add to that quantitative data to explain the conflict by some of the phrases that students used, like it was terrible and frustrating, and it made it difficult to deal with, and it was fine, but not worth the learning curve it took. So we had some commentary from students. Now, remember, I said there's a plot twist. Students don't love it, but here's the real conflict with the data. We actually find that they didn't like it, but it works. So despite disappointing student feedback, engagement actually increased. And so then I had evidence that students were actually viewing various resources in the course site 52% more in the gamified version than in the traditional version. And not only that, I find that they had a little bit of performance increase. So 3%, they demonstrated 3% higher scores on 2 key assignments in the gamified version. And so you see the little check mark because this is how I'm drawing the conclusion. Of course, those check marks weren't on the actual slides. Those are just to help you see where we are in the story between characters, conflict, and context, conflict, and conclusion. And so then I brought it all the way back to where I had started by saying, hey, let's discuss some possible use case scenarios. When should you use gamified platform? When should you use the traditional platform? Okay. So is that making sense? How we can set up a storyline using those 4 C's: character, context, conflict, and conclusion. I'd be curious to see if any of you might have some presentations where that would be useful. Okay, so now you know those 2 major ways of organizing your data. You've got recommendation speeches, where you're using the what is the recommendation, why, and each why is supported with your evidence. And then you also have your 4 C's of storytelling, where you set up the characters in the context, then you move to the conflict and to the conclusion. As you're doing that, all the evidence that you have to support may end up in slide form or in visual form, or at least some of it will. So I want to go back to those 3 tips for visually presenting data. Write better titles, declutter, and focus your audience. This is a really cluttery slide. So let's say that in addition to testing students on the gamified version of class, we also wanted to see how many new users we could get in the 2 different systems. Okay. And our goal was to get 90 new users per month into these new systems. So what are some changes you would make to this slide to declutter it? Let's start with the decluttering tip. We could use Eunice's again, right? Eunice can just copy paste, because once again, yes, we've got those trend lines that we don't really need. But what else can you see that you might be able to change to declutter this slide? I bet you've got lots of good ideas on decluttering this slide. There's probably at least 5, maybe 6 different things we could do besides getting rid of trend lines. What else do you see that we might be able to do to get rid of some of this clutter? So much clutter. Any suggestions or ideas? It's such a mess. Your eyes are trying to take it in, right? There's a concept in this literature around visually communicating data. It's called the blink test. You should be able to glance at a slide, and before you even need to blink, have an idea of what to do, what it means, what am I to understand? What's the aha of this slide? And this slide does not pass the blink test, does it? Eunice, thank you. Reduce the font size in certain spots. There are, especially, I think these numbers, we could reduce the size and maybe even embed them in the bar if they're even important. I think another thing we could do is just get rid of those numbers. So thank you, Eunice. Great. Horizontal line for the target. Yeah. So let's focus the user. If 90 is our target, let's put one of those focused lines on it. Great. Take off the decimal point on the y-axis from the number of users. It's always 0.0. So why do we even need it? Let's get rid of that. Great tip. Love it. What else? Can you think of other ways we could? I think I'm not going to make these on the fly because I'm slow and messy, but the data labels overlap, yes, which creates all sorts of confusion for the reader. So again, here's where I think we could either embed them right into the bars or get rid of them altogether. So here's what the chart might look like if we made some of those changes you recommended. So we've decreased the font size. We put it in the bar so that they're not overlapping. It's easier to read, right? We got rid of those extra decimal points that you mentioned. Delay the display of the numbers at the top of each bar if we need them. I mean, again, we've got the y-axis, which shows it to us, but we didn't. I didn't add the goal line, but that would be a great way to focus this one. I left aligned the title again here with the y-axis. We got rid of the trend lines. I don't know if you remember, the other one had slanted text for the dates. Slanted text slows down a reader by a fairly significant percentage. So if you're wanting them to pass the blink test, you don't want anything that slows them down or creates more cognitive load for them. So by making the text on the x-axis more not slanted, but just regular horizontal text, that helps. And you may have noticed I also got rid of the year. So January 23, February 23. We didn't really need that every time. We can just add it once. Can we have a line chart instead of columns? Bingo. Not sure who our LinkedIn user is, but brilliant. Yes, anytime we are visualizing data that spans across time, we almost always want to think line chart instead of column charts, because in the bars, every one of these is a distinct piece of information that our brain has to grapple with. If instead we flipped this into a line chart, Now we essentially only have those two lines of data, and we can add the goal line in that somebody mentioned earlier to show that the target goal of 90 days. So those are so look how much just changing the type of visual we opted for made this a simple, easier read. Now, I think we could still declutter a little bit, and we could work on our titling. So maybe instead of just saying our goal was 90 users, maybe the story I'm trying to tell is that both platforms missed their goal of new users almost all the time. And if that's the case, that's the story I want to put in the headline. Okay. So people often say, well, statistics lie. That's not true. They don't, but they are such that we can frame them to tell different stories. Both are true, that both platforms missed the goal the majority of the time. But if the story that I want to tell is, hey, the traditional class actually did hit its user goal 3 times. If I want to focus on the celebration factor, I change that headline. I emphasize different aspects of the data, and I've changed the narrative a little bit. So you have to be ethical, obviously, and think with integrity about what your data is saying. You never want to use your data to tell out and out lies, but it's not a lie to say they both missed it the majority of the time. It's not a lie or an unethical usage to say, hey, the traditional class hit its goal 3 times. What's the story you're trying to tell? Your decision makers, the leaders who are watching you in your organization, watch for you to be more than just a reporter of information. They want to see that you have the ability to craft a narrative and to move a story down the pike a little bit. So great suggestions for that one. Here's one more that we'll do. So we start with a chart. And by the way, I'm sharing this example from a course that I took called Storytelling with Data. It's a great online course. I strongly encourage you to take it if you want, or buy the books. I'm not getting a kickback from the author here. I just happen to love these resources. The book Storytelling with You, Cole Nussbaumer Knaflic. This is the text, but there's a great Storytelling with Data Let's Practice book. And I loved this one because some of these practice examples are right in the book, but you get to play with them. So strong recommendation there to look into those books or that class if you're looking for even more information than you're getting here today. So again, what are some changes? Can we have a line chart? Oh, instead of the column chart? Well, again, is a chart like this our best option? I like that the designer of this tried to focus us a little bit by putting some numbers in the green. That makes me think, oh, we're supposed to be focusing on the referral data. But here again, if we picked a different visual altogether, we can grapple with this content a lot better. Yeah, okay. I will share the names in the chat for the books. Absolutely. In fact, why don't I do that right now before I forget? Or, oops, I'm moving ahead here too fast. All right. Here we go. Remind me to come back to that, or maybe we've got Natasha in the background. Natasha, maybe you can look up Cole Nussbaumer's books and put that in the chat for everybody. And again, the class, if you want to take the class, is called Storytelling with Data. So she can Google that and give us some links to it. So again, I'm moving from a chart to a line graph. Makes a huge difference. I use intensity to focus people on referral. If that's the line we really want to focus on, maybe we don't even need total and organic on this chart. I could use a call out. So remember, the ways we can highlight or focus an audience are through call outs, intensity, and color. And there I changed the title again. I want to point out, I want to make this into more than just a placeholder. Conversion rate over time, placeholder, didn't tell us anything. Referral, whatever that means, are referral leads. Maybe these are different types of leads that salespeople get. The referrals decreased markedly since 2010. Now I'm actually telling a story. And I've put some additional information in here to explain some of the data, etc. All right. Yeah, a cumulative chart would be an interesting choice. Yeah, you can say more about that. So I mentioned that you're going to help the audience by focus using color. Let me give you a quick example of that. Will you count the number of sixes in this chart and notice how long it takes you to do it? I haven't seen anyone comment it yet. Nobody's got it. Still counting. How long does it take to count all the sixes? How many sixes are in this chart? We're still not there. No one's got it yet. All right, look. Pro tip, focus, boom. How many sixes are there? 4. You got it. You're on, right? Unless I was tricking you and didn't highlight one. But in visuals, we don't want to trick an audience. Yeah, of course, there's 4. We see it immediately. So focusing your audience using color is a great tip. Now, you just have to remember not to get crazy with your color and go overboard. Here, I've decided to color coordinate all the 8s, all the 6s, all the 9s, all the 1s. And then our eyes don't pick out. I mean, it's still easier than when they were all the same color, but it's not as easy as when we limited the colors to just the 2, one piece of data per. We're really trying to get to where our slides are just one piece of data, one conclusion per slide, okay? And that helps. Last but not least, I wanted to remind you that not all of your visuals need to be digital. They don't all need to be electronic. So I want you to think back to 2008. Some of you were children in 2008 if you were here. And this was when Steve Jobs introduced MacBook to the world. Now, I want you to imagine if they had come out with a slide like this, where they said, look, it is only 21 centimeters in depth and 30 centimeters wide and only a centimeter and a half in its height. But no. Remember what he did instead? Does anybody remember how Steve Jobs introduced MacBook Air to the world? He did this. He pulled it out of an inner office, like a manila folder that everybody was familiar with. We'd all seen it. He pulled that out. The audience gasps, and it became, one of the world's best-selling laptops of its time because he didn't even use an electronic visual in this case. He used a comparison that was something familiar to your audience. So that would be my last tip that I wanted to share with you today. So let me review these tips. And as I'm doing that, I would love to hear in the comments, what is the tip you've heard today that you're most likely to use? So which tip are you going to use? So here's just a reminder of what those tips were. Get it organized. If you're making recommendations, you're going to use the what, why pattern of organization. Or maybe you do more where you're not actually making a recommendation, but you've done deep analysis and that analysis has helped you reach a specific conclusion that your company needed to hear from you, in which case you might want to use those 4 C's of storytelling. You might want to put the humans that are going to be affected by your data back into the story. You might want to give a little bit of context, but help us see how the data and the story included some tension, some conflict, and how that conflict was resolved by your research and your analysis. Your data, your slides are coming from the data of the presentation. Too many people waste a lot of slides by just putting their recommendation on the slide or their reasons why. You can talk through those. People can hear that. What they really need visualized for them are when we get into more numerical data or statistical data that they need to help it see. And you don't always have to use electronic slides. We can use other types of visual or verbal comparisons. So of those tips, and then one more set here of tips on the visual tips that we talked about, I want to hear in the comments which one you think you're most likely to use. And our last 3 tips were about these pro tips for visually communicating your data. Our 3 tips were create headline titles. Remember, informative titles that read like newspaper headlines. Declutter, and there's a list of ways you coached me to declutter today. I guess we didn't talk about that one too much, but if you're using bar charts or column charts, make sure that the white space in between the bars is at least half of what the size of the bar or the column itself. We talked about getting rid of unnecessary decimals and numeric placeholders, avoiding slanted text, aligning text, embedding legends, eliminating trend bars. Shelby loves the idea of the blink test. Yeah, can someone just glance at a slide and know what they should use? Number 3 of our visual tips was focus the audience using color, callouts, hue, and intensity. Are there ways you're going to focus your audience? Which of those tips works for you? And in addition to which tip you will use, I think some of you are frantically typing right now. I would be so curious to hear if you have other tips that, Eunice, I'm so glad you're going to use the 4 C's. A good story always resonates with an audience. I've done a whole other live show on how to use the 4 C's. And hopefully we can note Eunice's username and get a link to that show for Eunice so that you can follow up there. We haven't yet put, I don't think I saw in the chat, the links to the storytelling with data information. So maybe we can do that. Storytelling with data with Cole, Nussbaum, or Knaflick, if you want to put that in the chat room, Shelby or Natasha, that would be great. What tips do you use for visualizing data that I didn't talk about yet today, but that you think would be helpful to the other users online? What else could they benefit from hearing? Do you have a tip that you just, every time you look at a slide deck that you didn't design, does it annoy you if they don't do a certain thing? Is there something that you're particularly proud of when you do it? Abigail loves decluttering, puts it in lots of things into perspective for me. So glad this was useful to you, Abigail. And I'm anxious to hear your comments later about how you're decluttering, which of those decluttering techniques is working for you. All of you, if you haven't connected with me on LinkedIn, I hope you will, so that you can message me when you use any of these tips that we've talked about. I would love to know that the content was useful to you, or if you have other tips you want to share, I'd love to learn from you as well. Some upcoming things to think about. If this kind of information is useful to you, I have a brand new course just released in the last couple of weeks on LinkedIn called Strategic Communication for Leaders. And I think anyone, whether you have a formal title of a leader or you're an informal leader, if you're here thinking about how do I better communicate with data, that's a course that might be interesting to you. I think we may have a QR code that will flash here in a little bit that will get you to that Strategic Communication for Leaders course in the LinkedIn Learning Library. And next month on September 24th at 12 noon, the guest is going to be John Ullman. John also has a new course on leadership. So if you want to know how to lead and inspire others to dream bigger, to learn more, to do more, to become more, come listen to John next month on September 24th. He is amazing. I see that I've got the resource now in the Storytelling with Data website where you can access the courses, a lot of great resources for free, as well as access to the books that Cole has written. And again, I encourage you to watch my new course on LinkedIn, Strategic Communication for Leaders. Thank you, everyone, for your insights and for your ideas. I hope you put it to work. Take care.